Hello and welcome to the Graham Sibbald Podcast. My name is Jorja and I'll be your presenter today. This week's episode is all about the Glasgow residential property market. We're going to be speaking to David Hyde to give an insight and opinion into the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the Glasgow property market. So sit back, relax and enjoy this week's episode of the Graham Sibbald Podcast. Welcome to the Graham Sibbald Podcast. We are here today with David Hyde, who is an associate and residential surveyor based within the firm's Glasgow office. Morning, David. How are you?
Yeah, really good, thanks.
Good. Glad to hear it. So usually we start these episodes with a little introduction. So David, could you please tell the listeners a little bit about your role within Graham Sibbald?
So I'm an associate residential surveyor working out of the Glasgow office. So I've been with the Graham Sibbald for about 5 years now. Joined probably about this time in 2016 and been part of a team headed up by Dominic McCormick. And we've also got other surveyors within the Glasgow office working out the residential department, but part of quite a big office, with around circa 70 employees just within the Glasgow office. So it's quite a big office, but at the moment we're all working from home, so it's been a bit strange. But day to day I carry out mostly home reports and valuations for various clients like lenders. But our main focus of work is home reports.
Amazing. You mentioned working from home there, which is obviously just one of the changes that has occurred out of the pandemic. And obviously it's been a total mad year almost. But exactly how has COVID-19 impacted the Glasgow residential property market and why was it just so busy from mid-2020?
Yeah, I think COVID just affected pretty much everybody globally, but in terms of, locally within the residential market, since the lockdown was eased, the market, or before the lockdown, it was relatively busy, and then after the lockdown came into force, it was pretty tight, the restrictions. We couldn't do any kind of surveys, any physical inspections due to the government restrictions. So it was really, really difficult from a business point of view to see where sort of the end of that would be. We went from having a good start to the year and then having no surveys coming in at all. But once the lockdown was lifted, it was almost like, a tap had been turned on. And typically that time of year, March onwards, people are tending to put their property on the market as well. Springtime, you get lighter nights. People can go and do viewings after 5 o'clock at night, things like that. So, that was also a big factor where nobody could then put out their property on the market. So there was a big backlog. So coming out sort of June time when the restrictions were lifted, it made the market really, really sort of stressed, I guess, and we found a real backlog of instructions coming through. But also I think people during lockdown as well maybe reassessed what they needed out of a property. So people maybe living in a flat maybe wanted a garden, and vice versa. Maybe people living in a bigger house maybe thought this is too big for us, we don't really need this. So it worked both ways. But we did find there was more flats probably coming on than houses. So it meant that people who were looking for houses were really, really struggling to sort of win within the closing date. And ultimately, that meant that people were having to bid way over home report value. But not also that, the level of instructions was probably coincided with low interest rates as well for mortgages. So people are really finding it quite easy to get a mortgage, whether it's first-time buyers or such. And also probably the Help to Buy scheme helped quite a lot for properties, new build properties. And I spoke to a builder recently, one of the agents for a mainstream builder, and they basically said that 65% of their sales were all funded by the Help to Buy scheme. So you could see how a lot of the activity was coming from there as well. So yeah, the volume of the reports at the time was unbelievable, but we somehow managed to get through it. I don't know how we managed it, but it was unbelievable. So we're glad that it's sort of calmed down and it's sort of got back to a normal level now, which is good. So
yeah, lots going on. In terms of like local areas, are any doing better than others? And if so, why do you think this could be?
Typically, I think In Glasgow, usually the areas are probably fueled by schooling and amenities. So south side of Glasgow, north side of Glasgow are pretty good for schools. And generally people are looking to purchase properties there. So we did find really exceptional levels of a demand in these areas, but I don't think that was necessarily unusual. Even given, before COVID, I think there was still a high demand for properties in that area. But typically, yeah, the West End and South Side did exceptionally well, and it was just due to the lack of demand. The lack of the supply coming on and the high demand coming on. On balance, also, I think a lot of places performed really well, maybe out with towns of Glasgow, maybe within Lanarkshire, maybe places like Paisley, or but also out with into rural areas as well. People were finding that they were going into a situation where they were allowed to work from home. They weren't having to be within, say, 30 minutes commute into the city, or they can now live down the coast, or they could live within, a rural property as long as they had broadband. And I think there was no lack of demand really in any areas. So it's been pretty positive, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely really interesting, all like the changes that we've seen purely down to the pandemic. And obviously regulations have been put in place throughout the pandemic, but you have to go on survey. So how have your teams adapted to ensure that all the surveys have been carried out safely?
Yeah, well, I think the firm has been really, really good since lockdown, and really set up all the offices to start with all the measures required, which has been exceptional, to be honest. And luckily, we've not had a lot of cases of COVID within the firm. So they've been really well organised in that. Set of circumstances. But secondly, I think we've been given all the necessary PPE to undertake surveys, and also take the necessary precautions before and sort of during and after the survey. So when the admin team are arranging the survey, the necessary checks are made out by the staff by asking whether the instructing party has any symptoms, or potentially awaiting a test for COVID. And then they're given an overview of necessary precautions required in order for the surveyor to carry out the survey as per the government guidelines. So this would be, for example, the loft hatch in a property being open and ready for inspection, maybe doors open or windows ajar, to allow circulation of air and minimise contact of the surfaces within the property. Our surveyors are also being given the appropriate PPE from gloves, masks, sanitising equipment, which are used before and after entering the property. It's also been really difficult in a lot of ways because we're used to sort of walking around the property, touching surfaces, going into the loft hatch, being able to, I guess, have a free reign of touching surfaces. But it's been really, really difficult, and I think a lot of homeowners have probably found that as well. We were having to say, can you set up the loft hatch? We're trying to minimise touching surfaces, and I suppose it's just adjusting to that. And I think just wearing masks generally, I'm sure a lot of the population find it extremely strange still. So I think that's important that we've managed to cope with that, and it ensures that the property market is sticking to the rules and we're able to stay open for business.
Definitely. It's great to hear you've all managed to adapt and stay safe whilst doing so. So just to finish up, what is next for the Glasgow property market?
It's difficult to say, to be honest with you. I think good news is that the vaccine's getting out to a lot of the population, so hopefully things will relax over the next couple of months. But it's really hard to say how things will pan out. But we've had a good start to the year. The number of instructions coming through has been pretty steady. And we've had a lot of positive news from estate agents saying they're still selling properties really well. So as long as the banks are still lending, people are able to get a mortgage, and it should be okay. But it will be interesting to see once the furlough scheme ends how things will pan out. So I think that will be the true test to see where the property market will go. But the thing is, life doesn't stop really. So people always want to upsize, start a family, and people want to downsize, and so the property market by due course never really stops. But it's just, other things maybe have an effect on it, don't allow it to keep going and functioning properly. So I think in terms of the Glasgow market, it's been pretty strong, and there's a lot of upcoming areas as well coming through. But it'll just be interesting to see how things change, I guess, as well. People working from home, maybe there's less demand for people to maybe be in the city centre as well. So it'll be interesting to see, but that might take a couple of years for that all to filter through. So interesting times ahead.
Definitely. The gift that keeps on giving, that's COVID-19. So we'll see what it has in store for us. Well, thank you so much for your time today, David. It was great to chat to you.
Yeah, that's been great. Thanks very much for your time.
Well, thanks again to David for coming on to this week's episode of the Graham Sibbald Podcast to talk about the Glasgow property market. It's been so interesting to find out about how COVID-19 has affected Glasgow and the property market, and obviously how Graham Sibbald are keeping their clients and their staff safe during this pandemic. If you enjoyed this week's episode, you can always check out the Graham Sibbald YouTube channel, or if you'd like to instruct a survey or receive a free no obligation quote, please go to www.g-s.co.uk. Thanks again for joining us on this week's episode of the Graham Sibbald Podcast. I'm Jorja, and I hope that you stay safe.